This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. We're all good. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Jane Clair Tyner, the communications manager at man, I can't talk. I've been working all day at End It for Good, a nonprofit advocating for health-centered approaches to drug use and addiction. Her journey to this work began with her experience as a mother who lost her son Asa to addiction. With a background in advocacy and a passion for justice, Jane Clair brings an experienced and compassionate voice to the conversation around drug policy reform. We will be discussing her journey on the show today. Jane Clair, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
I'm really excited to talk to you. Like we were discussing before the show, I had Christina Dent, who I know is, I think, one of the co-founders of End It for Good on the podcast.
She's the founder.
Yeah, the founder, about a year and a half ago. And that was an awesome conversation. I know that my audience really enjoyed hearing from her. And so I'm really excited to talk to you about this today. You have an extremely personal experience, and I'm just ready to hear your perspective on all this. And I think it's going to be good for the audience. But before we do that, just introduce yourself to the listeners today.
My name is Jane Clair Tyner. I was born, reared my own in Mississippi. I still live in Mississippi today. I had the ability to really stay home with my children when they were younger. And so I did that until they were able to make their own sandwiches and walk to school and do those kinds of things. And then I really went back out into the work world, and I found myself in software, which was not at all my background, but I kind of had a niche for business development end of things. And so I did that for many, many years. And then not long after my youngest two children flew the coop and went off to college, I lost my firstborn son, Asa. And that was in January of 2019. And so, a year later, the pandemic hits. And so there were just a couple of years where I was really in free fall. But it was a good thing in the sense that I really was allowed the time to grieve and to visit grief and all its manifestations. And so this job with End It for Good came available, and I didn't really see that I had a whole lot of qualifications for it, but it became something so personal to me, the need to advocate for new solutions to drugs and addiction. And so I've been with them. We'll be coming up on 3 years in July.
Yeah, I think that, I'm in Kentucky. And so for those of us that are in the South, obviously, like the drug epidemic, as they've called it, has hit us particularly hard. And so I know people personally that have been through these kind of experiences. And I think pretty much everyone in our context knows at least somebody who's dealt with it. But you had to deal with it straight on personally in a very, very impactful way. So just talk to us about your experience with your son and everything that happened with that.
So, I was a single mother and had very close relationships with all my children growing up. We were very candid about all the world's problems. We talked very openly about things. I was fortunate to have some pretty good basic knowledge of the science of addiction. And so something we grew up talking about, drugs, the potential for dangers. And I, it's strange. I really thought that having that ability to empirically see how addiction happens in the brain and the changes that happen to a person would protect me somehow from the emotional consequences of living through it. And so, my son began experimenting as a teenager, and there's a lot of data to show that teenagers they experiment. There's a lack of frontal lobe development, and a lot of children age out of their drug use. And so at first it wasn't that I didn't take it seriously and we didn't address it. It was just one of those things that it seemed as though it wasn't really going to be a tremendous problem. Straight A student, highest honors in his Latin class at his Christian school. I mean, very, very, very smart guy. So it really kind of caught me by surprise when it became, this is really a problem for you in particular. And I didn't know what resources I really needed for myself. I was fortunate that we were in positions where we could afford to put Asa through rehabilitation. And while that those were certainly helpful, I really didn't know the things that I needed to care for me and the rest of my family as we went through those things. Asa, right before he died, he'd had a really great sober 6 months, went to school, 3.85, was very determined, very eager. And then he had a looming court case coming up that was going to be for a possession driving under the influence charge. And somewhere in his mind, he had really concluded that he was a three strikes you're out kid, and that's what was going to happen to him. And I think that it really consumed him in a way that he didn't know how to handle it, and he began using opiates, which is something that he had never used before. And it just went so quickly. I mean, literally in a matter of a couple of months of using, he was gone. So that's, there's so much to say about all the different things that you go through when you love someone who's suffering with substance use disorder. Ultimately, it's funny. I was reading through the questions that you sent me beforehand and about like how, what changed for me regarding my thoughts on drugs prior to this experience. And one was, I believed in decriminalization prior, but I had never really thought about how prohibition was at the root of so many of the other issues that we see.
Yeah. So in just the months and years after this happened, what just in your personal life, what has shifted in your thinking? And maybe not even necessarily with just respect to policy, but in general, I know you dealt with this in 2019 and then immediately had to go through COVID. Just talk to us about that process of change after having a traumatic event like this happen.
The world never really quite looks the same. There is a filter on everything in a way. There's also really the things that are joyous to me now are so much more joyous. I mean, there is this strange appreciation that comes from the depths of grief, this acknowledgement and this expansion of joy when we experience it. Grief is one of those strange things that is both simultaneously stagnant and ever evolving. And that's I heard Stephen Colbert say in an interview that he considered grief a gift, and in many ways it is. It does enlarge us to other people. It enlarges us to really the deep complexities and the fragility of life.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really powerful. And it is incredible how those insights can come out of something that is so sad, really. You said that one of the first things that you identified after this was the fact that you believe that drug policy was at the root of these situations. And I know that in kind of popular discourse, people tend to blame the drugs themselves and don't really ever think about the policy frameworks for this. So talk to us a little bit about how drug policy has failed and about how your experience showed you just how ineffective these policies were at actually solving the problems they were intended to solve.
I don't know that I would say that it's policy alone by any stretch of the imagination. I think what we have wrong about the whole issue of drug use and addiction, a bunch of things. there's a difference between drug use, drug misuse, and drug abuse. And when we get to the place of addiction and the problematic behaviors that can come from that, what we've really failed to do is acknowledge that it is a complex health issue. There are physiological differences that are happening in someone's brain when they have entered addiction that constitute as a medical condition. And because we fail to acknowledge it and treat it in that way, we don't treat it. We just continue to do things to not even really mitigate it, but just to try to stop it altogether. I, drug prevention is a really strange thing. The thing that prevents drug use are things like adequate access to resources, things like connection, things like a sense of belonging and purpose. So I think that policy misses it because we are trying too desperately to get ahead of something that you can't get ahead of. In the entire annals of history that are written, we've seen humans have always been using mind-altering substances. It is something that humans do. So to try to stop that by saying we're not going to give you access to a specific substance just means that people are going to find other substances. That's just the way it works. Good, bad. We can argue that forever. It doesn't change the fact that is a fundamental of humans, is this desire to alter their perception and their realities. It just is. And we can't, if that's because of the fall of Adam and sin, it's great. We can't prevent it, though, from saying it's just illegal, right?
Yeah. No, that you're exactly right. And I think that you made a really good point. People expect there to be a very simple solution to what is an extremely complex problem, and they never think about all of the various factors that go into creating this problem in the first place. One of the things that you point out, and I think that this is a really great starting point, because this is something that people that might have a deeply ingrained set of assumptions about drugs and the drug war and everything, this is something that I think gets to the heart of how we can begin to rethink about this. And that's the fact that a lot of these drug policies are actually producing statistical disparities. And so there are certain races and socioeconomic statuses that are treated differently with respect to the way that drug policy is enforced. And to a certain extent, I've spent some time working with people in rehab in the past. And as I said before, I'm a public school teacher. And so I work with students who deal with this stuff in their personal life at home. There are some people who, under the policy framework, get treatment and they get sent to rehab and they get that kind of help. And then there are other people that just get sent to prison. And there's really no rational justification for why certain people are treated other ways. So talk to us a little about the disparities that are caused by the current regime, or the current policy regime of drugs in the United States.
I think it's not something that's particular to drug policy, right? These socioeconomic disparities in sentencing. And if we take white collar crime, for instance, right? How many people went to prison for the 2008 housing collapse?
Yeah.
One person was sentenced, and his first name is Kareem, and he was born in Cairo, Egypt, right? So it is not something specific to drug policy. It's kind of this framework that's going to be instituted in any system, in any country, because we are fallen. And power tends to want to hold power and amass more. And a good way to do that is through injustice, right? I think with drugs, it's just kind of so obvious. When, I'm 51, so I grew up as I was in high school, the crack epidemic came along, and then all of a sudden we get these mandatory sentences for crack and these much stiffer penalties for it. We didn't really see that eliminated the crack epidemic. And there was no bathroom stall on Wall Street that was bothered by the fact that their cocaine wasn't being bothered. Right. So it's really, it's really obvious in some ways when we look at our drug policies. The other thing about it that I find particularly egregious is knowing that people who are suffering with a substance use disorder have a medical condition, right? That there is a medical condition there that is to be treated. So to think that somehow we're going to treat it through imprisonment, through punishment, it's nonsensical. It doesn't work, and that makes it a little more. It just makes it a much worse approach for that reason. And the other thing that we know is that a lot of problematic drug use is begun and happens. It was preceded by a traumatic event. We know that. We know that poverty is a trauma. And so when you're looking at childhood poverty, and the thing about the trauma of poverty, we know it's a trauma, we can see what it does to the brain, we can see what it does to cognitive functioning, is that it's not an isolated event usually. It usually happens for months, for years. So you're talking about individuals who've grown up in this state of having, they are going through childhood with heightened states of cortisol, right? And it does play a part in how they respond to circumstances.
Yeah, that's true. And I've always felt that when we think about prison, you want murderers and like rapists and people like that need to be locked up. So we understand that that's a good for society. But then you have someone that's either using drugs or selling drugs, but has never done anything to harm anyone else, or have never engaged in any behavior that was like not consensual with another adult. And they're getting put in jail with these hardened criminals who have actually committed violent crimes against other people. And it just doesn't seem like, if you just look at it from that perspective, it doesn't seem like that makes any sense at all.
Right. I mean, there does, for a nation that part of its motto is rugged individualism, it seems really strange that we don't have personal autonomy when it comes to substance use.
Right. Yeah. And it's almost like and it's really interesting too, because you think about like you can go to the doctor, and if you have a certain problem, the doctor can prescribe you medication that does a lot of harm, that does have a lot of harm to your body. Like you look at the list of side effects for these prescription pharmaceuticals, and they go on and on and on, and doctors will just willingly prescribe them to you. But the moment that you try to self-medicate, then that becomes a crime, right. And you wind up getting punished for that by society. And I don't really see much of a moral difference between those two things in many cases.
You and I could go spend the night in a mid-sized city anywhere in America in their ER, and come morning, we would have seen mishaps, accidents, outright tragedies in which alcohol was involved. And yet we have safe consumption sites for alcohol all over the place. Yeah. So by the same token, in those same hospitals, there is use of fentanyl. That is a life-saving use of fentanyl. So it is this strange, kind of illogical thought process to those things. If we look at the data on accidents with alcohol, it's not less harmful, right?
Oh yeah.
So that's kind of one of those paralysis of thought.
Yeah. Well, and it's like, so I one of the questions I sent over to you beforehand, I know you're going to anticipate this, but I have a friend who is currently serving time in jail. He hasn't been fully convicted yet, but he's been in jail for over a year now for selling drugs. Basically, that's what it was. Yeah. And again, no full conviction. And I mean, and again, he acknowledges, that was like something that he did. But he's looking at several years in prison, and he never hurt anyone. He never shot anyone. He was simply selling. And that's it. And I know that there were a lot of people that would look at somebody like that and say, well, yeah, he deserves to go to prison for 10 years. But my whole thought is that he never harmed, like he never intended to harm anybody. He was not stealing or doing any of that stuff right there. But because he happen to be in the business of selling to other adults. He's looking at having a large portion of his life completely taken from him by the state. And it just seems like that's such an ineffective way of dealing with that. And then you also, again, going back to the problem that I was identifying before, you take people like that are not actual criminals in the sense of committing harm to somebody else, and you give them 10 years where they're locked up with people that did actually commit harm. That has to change people over time. Like, I would imagine that those people come out of jail in a worse position than when they went in.
Right. Even if you think that they broke the law, therefore do the crime, do the time. I think if we're taking a pragmatic look at it, what's the cost benefit analysis to the state for locking him up for 10 years? What, how is that beneficial overall? And we don't see that it is. We see that the time spent in prison usually doesn't lead to great outcomes after prison. It is an exception, not the rule, that it does. You're also talking about eliminating someone from the workforce. But if your friend was using drugs and he had a drug issue, one of the ways that we know that help people get away from their use is connection, family, friends, work. So you've just stripped him of those things. It's not that it's just that the punishment doesn't seem to fit the crime, right? It's also that, is it helping the underlying issue, or is it creating more?
Yeah. Well, and what are the financial incentives for, I guess, government employees that are involved in the drug war? So you look at, like, there's a prison wardens union. You have police departments that receive, billions of dollars a year, I guess, in aggregate, in grants to fight the war on drugs. You have politicians that are able to get reelected based on making promises about solving the drug crisis. So it seems like there's actually a lot of people that financially benefit from the current policy framework that have no financial incentive to want to change it, because it might harm their source of income. Do you think that's a part of it as well?
Do I personally think that's a part of it? I mean, sure, right? The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think Christ is quoted as saying twice in two different gospels, where your treasure lies, there lies your heart. So, sure, of course, money can be a motivator for all sorts of ill.
Yeah. And I just think these are factors, again, it's like you were saying before, that's so complicated. These are factors that people have to take into consideration. And your particular approach to solving the problem is what you call harm reduction on the one hand, and then regulation on the other. So explain what you mean by each of these terms and why they're superior to the current framework that we have now.
So when we look at harm reduction, it really is just its name, right? When we go back to the example of the drug alcohol, we have all sorts of harm reduction things that are in place to help those who choose to use. For instance, if I go into the liquor store, I know exactly what proof the liquor is that I'm going to buy. I even know how many calories are in it. I know all of the ingredients that are in it. There are certain laws that prevent me from that say you're welcome to use. We that's fine, but we don't want you to harm anyone else. Therefore, you can't drive while you're doing it. That's a harm reduction practice. When it comes to other drugs, it may look different. Part of it looks different. One thing that a harm reduction does would be to say what's in the substance by giving people things like fentanyl test strips. Ultimately, there are two underlying premises that I think harm reduction should be based on. And one, for me, is that all lives do matter. And that includes people who choose to use substances, and it includes people suffering with substance use disorder. Again, back to this tendency of man to use substances. We're not ever going to completely eradicate that. So why would we not say, if you're going to use, here are the ways that you can do so safely? And as for people who are suffering with substance use disorder, it's another day. We don't know when that moment's going to come that they're like, I'm ready. I'm ready for help. I'm ready for treatment. And we see that it works. That's the thing. We and from October of 2023 through September of 2024, we saw a 24% reduction in the overdose death rate. Still a huge number, but 24% is that's not a blip, right? And a lot of that was because we know that money was diverted to go towards harm reduction procedures. Narcan, some funding went to safe injection sites, fentanyl testing strips. Are we saying if we take that funding away, that those people that it kept alive, that their lives aren't worth it? Is that what we're saying? If we're saying we're going to strip that, and if I understand, there's an argument. I don't buy the data. Who put the data together? I don't buy that.
Right.
Fine. Go talk to your county coroner. Ask them.
Yeah.
Go talk to your EMS workers. Go talk to your ER workers. Talk to your pastors. Go ask the people doing the work. It was a noticeable trend. So, as a mother who has lost a child, for me, the great the thing about harm reduction is the promise of that. It's just it's another day. It's another chance to get to recovery.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think so much of this, as you've kind of already alluded to, has to do with the fact that Americans they just fundamentally misunderstand what's actually going on here. There are all of these misconceptions about drug use in general and about the reasons for people using drugs and about the consequences of them, like even the biochemical results of using drugs. There's just a lot of misconceptions about how this actually works. And so what are some of the, and again, especially coming out of a Christian context where people have been taught to just, if you hear the word drug, then it must be necessarily evil. And we need to do everything we can to stop people from using it and punish those that do, which is what a lot of Christians in America truly believe. Like, they really do believe that this is the way that we should handle the drug problem. What are some of the misconceptions that we need to overcome or change in order to start thinking about this a little more clearly?
I think one of the things is this weird arbitrary scale on the danger of substances. We're saying alcohol is fine in moderation, but this other drug is not. And it's really not based on any factual anything. It's a very arbitrary system. Again, we go to the hospital and see fentanyl being used and people leaving the hospital not addicted to fentanyl, right? Yeah. So I think that has to stop. That certain substances are automatically, if you use them, any use of them is automatically problematic use, because it's just not true. The evidence isn't there to back that up. That's one thing. The other thing is that we really have to look at substance use disorder as a medical issue. And until we start looking at it from the perspective of health and treating it from the perspective of health, we're not going to change it. So overall, Americans have to do, I think as a culture, we have to do that shift. And that's one of the reasons that I think regulation of substances, I don't think we can get there until we have that shift. But it continues to see that the needs of individuals are fit, but in a framework that is safe. And also that whole difference between use, misuse, and abuse. There are distinct differences there. The prohibition model, if it didn't work for the drug alcohol, why do we think it's going to work for any other substance? We've been doing this for not just since 70s Nixon Declaration on War. We're really coming up on 100 years of this. And we, new drugs really were using the same battle plan. And it's absolutely proven ineffective. So on a very basic level, it's why would you continue to do something that you have seen is absolutely ineffective?
Yeah.
And I think that we are at a place where people are really frustrated with the status quo. And sadly, more and more people are not several degrees away from being impacted. They know people who have been impacted. They've seen it. And as more Americans are really just living with it and seeing it, I think that will help to change perception as well.
Yeah, and I want to spend a few minutes tackling some of the ways that people have tried to address the drug problem and just get your response to them, because I think it's like we were saying, there are these ideas that are so deeply ingrained in the American social psyche that we have a very hard time seeing outside of them. One of the ones that I find particularly interesting are drug prevention programs in public schools. Like I said before the show, I'm a public school teacher, and I was in elementary school in the 90s and middle school in the middle school and high school in the 2000s. And DARE was kind of the drug prevention program of the day back then. And I remember that, like, I always thought that it was really cheesy on the one hand. And then it also kind of like, it almost created a certain taboo around drug use that encouraged certain kids to try them that would not have tried them otherwise. And I look at the way that, like, right now, the big drug prevention program, it's not even a drug. It's, well, I guess it's technically classified as a form of a drug, but the big prevention program right now is with vaping. And like watching some of the materials that they show our kids in school, like, yeah, vaping's bad, and it is like a problem because there are a lot of teenagers that vape, but it's like, it's pretty obvious that the materials that they show them are full of propaganda, and it seems like it's a script that could be written by the tobacco companies. And on top of that, they're like, no one takes it seriously. Like, so the kids like laugh at the fact that they're having to watch these videos, and it doesn't seem like it actually stops anyone from not vaping in the same way that those drug prevention programs didn't seem to be effective either. So I wanted to get your perspective on that. Do you think that these prevention programs maybe cause more harm than good? And if there is a proper place for drug prevention programs in schools, what would that even look like?
I think for the question as to are drug prevention programs in schools effective, I don't know, I haven't researched it, but I've read the room, right? And so I would say obviously they're not. I think the key there is this idea in the word prevention. If the goal is to prevent use, misuse, and addiction, then we have to go back to those key things that really cause people to go there, right? We have to give our children access to mental health. We have to teach them coping skills. We have to teach them how to deal with the things that that happen in life. Unfortunately, most childhood traumas, before we've ever heard the first thing about mindful breathing, right? So if we want to prevent, then we have to say what are the things that are needed in this life to prevent it from seeking the need to leave it by taking a mind altering substance, right? That's number one.
Yeah.
The second thing is we need education for sure on all things. And I think there should be drug education in schools, just like I think there should be nutritional education in school and physical health education in school. Yeah. But as far as the allure goes, I remember my first drug ed class, 6th grade, Coach Ursula Sobieski came in to teach it. And these really trippy videos that she was showing us on the Betamax looked like they were made in the 1960s. And yeah. I remember walking out of there and thinking, yeah, the jumping out of the window, that sounds dumb. But the dancing pink elephants, I mean, who wouldn't want to see that? You know, I mean, so there is this weird thing. So how do we teach it? Right? We have to teach it from the perspective of education. Scare tactics is just another way of coercion. And we found that coercion just doesn't really work for a certain segment of the populace and a large segment of the populace.
Yeah. Now, a lot of parents really support the idea that there should be extremely harsh penalties for the sale and use of drugs. And I as a parent myself, and you understand this better than anyone, I can understand why you would want there to be protections for your kid, because it is kind of like what you experienced is the ultimate fear of a lot of parents. And so I understand the emotional reaction of saying, well, if we have these really tough policies in place, then maybe it will scare my kids into avoiding it altogether. But you've argued that that doesn't work. And so how do we begin to address parents that like rightfully are concerned that their kids might get involved in that, but that are wrong about the policy aspect of it?
I think you change your mind on that when your child starts using. When it becomes your child that could go to prison for a long time. I understand the emotional desire to punish anyone that harms your child. I get that. But in so doing, are you creating a greater risk for them? My son didn't overdose because he had a toxic level of drugs in his system. He froze to death because the house that he was at, the people who lived there were afraid, right? If I call the police and there's this guy here, am I going to go to jail? So I think that the question is, does it work? If you're putting harsher penalties and you're trying to make things stiffer, if your child is one who decides to experiment, then that just puts them at greater risk. So ultimately, is it going to do what you want these harsher penalties to do? Is it preventing use? No. Is it preventing sale? No. All it's doing is just making both of those things exceedingly more dangerous. That's what it does. That is the end result of how these things work out. So the protective desire of parents, get that, but you have to see, how does it actually play out when we put these things in motion?
Yeah, and before I became a teacher, I was a youth director for a long time, and so I did student ministries for many years. And one of the things that I realized, being kind of like a theologically conservative church, is that there were some parents that were just afraid to have conversations with their kids about these issues. Like they would not talk about drugs, they wouldn't talk about sex, they wouldn't talk about alcohol, they wouldn't talk about any of it. But if they found out that their kid wound up getting involved in one of those things, then their child was punished extremely harsh, and it created all of these problems. And this is something that I didn't just see like once or twice. This was a repeated pattern where parents wouldn't address these issues, and then it seemed like they responded in some very harmful ways when they found out that their kids were engaging in these behaviors. So I think my next question is actually twofold. How should parents talk to their kids about drugs? And then if they find that their kid is using, what's the best approach when they figure that out to try to get their child the help that they need?
I think those are questions for which there's really not an answer for a number of reasons. I'm a mother of three. My three progeny share a lot of DNA, they shared an environment, they shared some of the same traumas, and yet they have very, very different responses to how they handle things. And I've certainly would never tell any parent how to run their business. But I think the one thing that you need to do is to find out a way to help them figure out, when they start using, what is it you're missing that you think participate or using these substances is fixing, or what are you hurting? What's hurting you that's causing that you wish to avoid, right? To really get to those kind of heart levels. It's a hard thing. That's a hard thing to do. I also think that there is help out there. There is great help out there. There really is. Addiction science has come unbelievably far. And so the other thing that I would say to do is get yourself help first. I mean, not get not get your child help, but you seek counseling. Speak with someone who is an addiction specialist, who is a therapist, and go to them and ask them those questions. But ultimately, the question is to try to figure out why do you want to use these substances? The more we shame and punish, the more difficult it is to get to those answers. And in fact, I've never known anyone who's felt terribly shamed or extreme guilt or fear. Those things have caused them to open up.
Yeah. Everyone that I know that has gone through either AA or a drug rehab program has had support. It's not something that you generally find people can do on their own because it's such a big problem. And you are a big advocate of like communities stepping up to help people that are in need. And it's not just like the family, the family that surrounds the immediate family, but friends and people that are in those social circles. So how can communities come together to more effectively help people that are struggling with this? Like, what can we do collectively to make a difference in the lives of people that are trying to work their way through there? Which I would, like I said before, that has been like pretty much the key for everyone that I know that has successfully been through recovery. They had people in their corner that were fighting for them as well.
Right. Yeah, I mean, your personal experience bears that out, and so does research, right? That community is key to recovery. I think a really important thing that can be done through our churches is trying to break past the shame associated with drug use and addiction. And I think churches have a great responsibility to do that. Our churches are supposed to be hospitals. We're supposed to be the places that we can be the most hurting and in the most pain and find solace and comfort and support. I go to a little bitty church, but one of the things that my pastor does in our opening weekly prayer is he always, always mentions people who are suffering with addiction and those who love them. Simple things like that. I think that the main thing is to be able to listen without judgment and to make sure that it's a safe zone. There is no one who can't look out in their world and see the impact. If we're not addressing it by acknowledging that it's there, then all we're doing is pushing it deeper into the shadows. So I think the main thing that communities can do is to try to figure out ways that they can eliminate the shame surrounding it.
Yeah. And what would your approach be? Like, let's say that you're talking to a Christian who has, I guess, a traditional view on drugs and the way that drug use should be understood. What would be your approach for a specifically Christian audience to help them rethink how they understand addiction and their response to it? Because I really do feel, and again, I'm saying this from the perspective of a Christian who is in a very traditional church, and we have people that have dealt with this before. But I know for many families that have never really had to think about this, or it's never been on, it's always been on the margins or the periphery of their thought. It's just like so easy to say, well, drugs are bad and people shouldn't do them, and that's it. But it's not that easy. So how do we go about helping a Christian audience better understand what you've been talking about today? Which is, I know it's not an easy task in some places.
I think that the main thing is this idea to remember that even a drug addict is created in the image of God, and they are worthy of grace. They and we are called to extend that grace. So I think first we have to start there with the idea that we must show grace to these people too, regardless of this sin of drug use. Ultimately, hurting people do things to find ways to help with their hurt. So I think we're called as Christians to live in such a way that is to show people how we are to live in community and how we are to build each other up. And really, we're supposed to be showing what the new kingdom is going to look like. And so the idea is not to leave these people on street corners and let them die and languish in their suffering, but it's to find ways to help them. As long as I've been alive, growing up in Mississippi, I've heard the church talk about the need for a revival, right?
Oh, yeah.
When you look at church history over the course of the centuries of church history, we see that revival happens when Christians have rushed in to the problem, whether it's a plague, whether it's a famine, rather than sequester and lock themselves up. They went into where the harm was and helped. This is an opportunity to do that.
Yeah. Do you find it difficult to be an advocate for this, considering your personal story, or do you find that is a motivating factor for you?
Yeah, it's certainly a motivating factor. I don't think I could not advocate. And I don't find that it makes it, people ask me that a lot. And I think one of the reasons that we are given terrible griefs and the reason that they're gifts is because it does allow us to sit with other people in their grief and to hear them. So I don't think I would be using the experience wisely, prudently, or in service to the kingdom if I didn't.
Yeah.
And so no, it's not more difficult.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Well, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your story today. There's just a lot to chew on here, and I really do hope that everyone in my audience, there is, but it's great. We need to be having these conversations, and this is so important for so many people. And this is definitely, it needs to be at the forefront of the conversation that we're having in our country today. So I think that this is really great. I just got a couple questions kind of to wrap this up for you. What do you think the logical path to reform is? So how do we go about actually making a real impact in this area?
It's another big question, right?
Yeah, it is.
And if you ask 10 people working in drug policy, you'd get 10 very different answers. I think the biggest thing we have to do is start addressing it as a health issue. And we have to see it as an epidemic. We have to see it as a crisis, a health crisis, and we have to address the public health issue and in that way. And that's going to change some thinking on it. But ultimately, that is how we will not just reform things, but it is how we reform things and create the best possible outcomes.
Yeah. Well, for people that hear this and want to join the cause, how can they do this? How can my listeners go about working to reach these goals?
A lot of ways. One, wherever you live, you have a circuit court judge and they have a lot of say over sentencing. Meet your circuit court judges, find out where they stand on issues. Is there a drug court of law and available? Does your church have a program that is a support group for people who are impacted or love people who are impacted? Could you start one of those? I think the number one thing people can get involved is to start sharing information, right? There's great information out there on where does all the fentanyl come from in America? How is it coming in here? What are the percentages of homeless people that are actually homeless because they suffer from addiction? Share the real data that's out there with people. That's one way. Have those conversations. Sometimes they're uncomfortable, sometimes they're prickly, but they have to be had. And the other way I would say is come join us at End It for Good. We've got all sorts of resources. We have podcasts to listen to. Get our founder Christina's book, read it, pass it out to friends. The main thing to do is to bring the topic to the dinner table, to the soccer field.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. Well, Jane Clair, again, thank you so much for coming on the show today and talking. If people want to contact you specifically, how can they do that? And then where can people find all of End It for Good's material?
Right. So the best place to go is to contact me or to find our material is on our website, which is just enditforgood.com. And you can find me there. If you look at our team, my email address is there and anyone's welcome to contact me that way. But we try to, I like to tell people that End It for Good, it's an invitation. It's an invitation to explore better pathways to treating old problems.
Yeah. Well, Jane Clair, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank
I
you.
really appreciate having you.
Thank you. I was glad to be here. Bye.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.